This is Teacher's Corner from Stenhouse Publishers. I'm Nate Butler. Children come to school to become better readers, writers, and thinkers, but they also walk into classrooms hoping to be happy. In her new book, Start with Joy, Egan Cunningham argues that happiness must be as much of a priority in teaching as proficiency or achievement. This episode of Teacher's Corner features Katie's conversation with Stenhouse's Faye LaCasse, taped on location in downtown Baltimore, Maryland.
I'm Faye LaCasse with Stenhouse Publishers, and I'm here today with Egan Cunningham, who is the author of one of our newest titles at Stenhouse, Start with Joy. So today I thought I could just talk to Katie about what made her write this really beautiful book.
Oh, thank you so much, Faye, and thank you for the opportunity to just come together and talk about this topic. I feel so privileged. Thanks.
So Katie, the book itself, the title in and of itself, Start with Joy, is just uplifting, just by itself. And I know at the heart of it is some research that you've done and seen on the science of happiness. So can you talk a little bit about what you know of the science of happiness and how that actually impacted your decision to write this book?
Yes, thanks so much for the question. I truthfully, my husband was doing a lot of reading. He's the biggest, widest reader that I know. And he was doing a lot of reading, taking out huge stacks from the library around books that were related to happiness. And I think as we reached a place in our life where we were sort of on our own personal quest for bringing more happiness to ourselves, to our marriage, to our children. And so he was reading all of these books first, and he was gently nudging me to read some of them. And I started to get really hooked on the ways in which we now truly have a science of happiness, that this is part of the science of the mind, and that there have been researchers for a few decades now that have really been studying the good. And that if we want to really understand what makes for a happy life, to talk to people that report the greatest measures of happiness, that they respond happier than other people. Let's look at what are the key tenets sort of that ground their lives. And there are a couple things that really stand out that are almost common sense, but are really simple ways that people can bring more happiness to their own lives, regardless of their circumstances. One big one is having a practice of gratitude, that especially in moments that are difficult, to try to see the good. And, whether it's your drive to work and you're stuck in traffic and trying to be grateful for the job that you have, be grateful that it's sunny out that day, be grateful that you can listen to podcasts, that oftentimes there is good hiding somewhere. So one really is this practice of gratitude. Another big one is that happier people tend to report that they have meaning and purpose in their life, and that those things can change over time, but that they feel as though they're part of a greater good and that they're contributing to that. Another one is strong social connections. That we know this, right? That people that feel as though they have a strong sense of belonging and connection in their life, and especially for children, in their families and in their schools, that they experience their days from a happier place. And another big one, finally, is also that people that report that they're happier have a sense of awe and wonder about, just the great mysteries of the world, and that they make their way through the world with a natural tendency to wonder about things. So all of that, for me, it was also a natural intersection with what we're already doing in the work of literacy learning, and that there was a natural fit for what we know from the science of happiness for the ways in which we can support children as readers, writers, speakers, listeners, creators, and thinkers.
What's interesting about that, your husband started reading about the science of happiness as an adult. And I actually know a lot of people who've done the same thing. One of my sisters is a nurse, and she's been doing a lot of work with schools on gratitude and the science of happiness. But your book is really about trying to build that at a younger age. And I know in reading the book, you talked about some of the experiences that researchers are finding during the course of a child's education. Somewhere around that adolescent age, you start to see more depression, and you start to see the joy that you think is natural with kids just diminish. So the fact that we're going to, through this book, try to build joy as a part of kind of your daily life for the students is really something unusual about the book, and one of the things that makes it special. I think I heard you say at some previous interview or at a presentation that this was influenced by your experience with your own children.
Yep.
So you were looking at it from the perspective of an educator and a mom.
Yes. So I'm always wearing all these multiple hats. So the book was also heavily influenced by watching my own children make their way through school and through life. I have 2 boys. And relatedly, I think that school is largely built for girls. So the ways in which different children might experience joy in life might be different than the ways in which their teachers did. So there's that dynamic. But my older son, he's 11 years old, and he's in 5th grade. And some years he has skipped to school, and he has had a smile on his face and told me stories about his day. And other years, it's a huge struggle. Particularly when the emphasis in the classroom is more around compliance and control and direction following than it is necessarily around learning and the natural joy that comes from learning something you didn't know before. And so this was also in response to that. We've also been really fortunate that our younger son, who's 8 and in 2nd grade, every single year he skips his way to school and he smiles and tells us stories, and he hasn't yet had a school experience that's made him doubt the purpose of school, that he still really believes in going to school every day, learning something new, finding new friendships and social connections, digging into new books and finding himself in different ways. And he hasn't had an experience yet that's jaded that. But we do wonder, when will that happen and why does it happen? And I think we also as a society really, we accept that so many students don't like school. We just accept this. And this book was also sort of a response in me to saying, this isn't something that we should accept. And that school by design should be a place that students look forward to going to and that they look forward to being there. And the way to do that is when we have choices in our instruction that we can say to ourselves, I can start with a lot of different things, but what if we start with joy as just the basis of how we begin every day, how we begin every lesson, how we begin every conference, how we begin every interaction with children. That when we start from a joyful place, that we give that joy to our students. And research is also coming out now that shows that we're really emotional chameleons. And so the joy I have, I give to others. But if I'm giving something other than joy, I am sometimes unintentionally imparting that onto my students as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. So the idea that the students are really picking up on what it is that the teacher's laying down every day. I mean, I don't think no teacher that I know, and I know many, many talented, dedicated teachers, intentionally want students not to be happy. But I think one of the things that really struck me was this idea of what you said, designing for building joy into your day. So one of the things I was wondering about is you come from a literacy background, you did some research on the science of happiness and done some reading on that. How do the two actually come together in a classroom for a teacher?
Yeah, it's a great question. And interestingly, before I was in education, my background in college was that I majored in architecture. And
That's the design part.
That's the design part. So I realized, maybe not early enough, because I completed the whole program, but I realized that I was not a very good architect. and that wasn't going to be my life path. But the learning process, we also really weren't trained to be architects. We were trained to be designers and thinkers. And so that process was really rooted in me. And then I was so fortunate to work in schools that really treated teachers like designers, that we were seen as curriculum creators, and we were really empowered to make learning as joyful and purposeful and memorable as possible. And that's really the design work of great teaching. And I also really find that great teachers intentionally design for experiences for students not just to think, but also to act and feel. And I was really fortunate to work in schools that believed in that student experience, that school was more than just cognition. It was about taking action in the world. It was about feeling things strongly. And so this book is oriented to support teachers to also have that designer mindset, even if you don't have that background, and that designers are problem solvers. And so are teachers, that teachers, especially in literacy learning, there are so many facets to learning how to read and write from a mechanical standpoint, but there are also so many facets to really being a fully fledged literate person in the world, that you see your literacy skills as being about more than decoding or comprehending, but about being a better citizen, being a better friend. And so all of the work really from the Science of Happiness I saw as a natural fit to what teachers are already doing with literacy instruction, that we want students to read and write stories and information pieces, but we also want them to read and write people, and to read and write kind of themselves, and to understand the world around them.
Yeah, there was a term in the book that I found really interesting, just jumping off of what you said, Katie. It was this term called self-literacy for the students. And I found that fascinating, because what I believe you're trying to get across was this idea of how do you teach the students to be attuned to their own thinking and their own emotions. Could you speak a little bit to that? Did I catch it right?
Yes. Yeah, I do. I use the term self-literacy because I think that's one of the biggest goals that we forget about. Like, yes, we want students to be able to make predictions and connections and ask questions and all of that important strategy work that we know that proficient readers automatically have. But I believe that the bigger work of literacy learning is that we are asking ourselves these questions throughout our whole lives. And do we have resources to answer them for ourselves? So the big questions I think that we ask ourselves our whole lives are: who am I? Where am I from? Who will I be? What do I believe? What do I stand for? And that to answer that is a lifelong quest. And if you start to feel more confident and secure with your answers to those questions, that's really the work of self-literacy. And how do we start to answer those questions? It's through books, right? That we see ourselves in characters, or we learn about characters whose lives are different from us. We answer those questions sometimes by writing our way to understanding. That personal narratives and poetry and songwriting, that those experiences help us answer those big lifelong questions. So yeah, that's when I was thinking about, well, what are like the big goals for literacy learning? I think that one of them is to support students to have greater self-literacy. And if you really understand yourself, you can start to understand others. So that's where it was coming from.
There was an example in the book where you had recommended that a teacher use some journaling, some real quick journal activity to kick off their literacy block. And in the process of doing that, I think the prompt was, how do you feel today? And this teacher found that one little girl in her class wrote, I am sad today, 3 days in a row. And that just struck me, because not only was the student getting to know how they felt the teacher was able to understand a little bit more about that student and then address her need. So that self-literacy, but actually also morphing into a way for the teacher to really get to know their students and become more responsive to their needs was something that I thought was really magical about that activity. How are you finding the teachers are responding to some of these prompts and some of these recommendations you're making?
It's such a great question. And the prompts that are in there, really, again, to credit my husband, he had gifted me the 5-minute journal a couple of years ago on Valentine's Day. And it was this great gift of love. And it's also based on the science of happiness and this idea that we are what we repeatedly do, not what we do once in a while. And so every day for 3 years now, I respond to the same 3 prompts every morning and the same 2 prompts every night. And the morning prompts are an I am grateful for statement. What would make today great? So projecting that and having something to look forward to. And an I am affirmation. And then the prompts at the end of the day are 3 amazing things that happened today and how could I have made today better? And so the student that you're referring to, she wrote in her journal, I am sad as her affirmation 3 days in a row. And the teacher bravely shared in just a small group session that we were having together that she'd seen that, but she also recognized that she hadn't gone up to that student yet to check in and to say, I hope it's okay, but I noticed in your journal that you wrote this. But also by talking about this, she was recognizing it and realizing that she needed to take action and just be an emotional touchstone for that student. Some teachers, I've encouraged and worked with teachers before to try the journaling practice themselves first. And some teachers say, gosh, it changes their life. It makes their relationships stronger. It makes their teaching stronger. It makes them more appreciative of the work and purpose that they have. And others sometimes say, gosh, this is really hard. It's actually not something I look forward to. And then but they also then say, but that's also why I have to do it. Because if jotting about what I'm grateful for and affirmations I have for myself and things I look forward to is hard for me, what does that mean for the ways in which I engage with my students? And I want to give that to them, so I have to do this for myself first. Teachers also who have taken this on with their students realize that it's very simple and that the students are the ones that start to drive it. So they'll say, oh gosh, we need to do our journaling time. And the students are the ones that end up really taking the lead on it because teachers have so many things that they're thinking about. We make more decisions than surgeons do. And the hundreds of decisions a day that teachers are called to answer and figure out can be overwhelming. And so it's also a beautiful technique that I have seen students become the drivers of it, which is empowering for them. And teachers have really kindly shared with me snippets of things that students write. And they write really profound, beautiful things. Third graders writing funny things like what would make my day great is having a free donut because that would make anybody's day great, right?
Maybe related to that student.
But they also write things like one of the most profound things a student wrote was something that would make my day great is getting a lot of problems right. And, that's an invitation for a conversation. Tell me more about that. Tell me about, the ways in which sometimes getting problems right feels good for you. And that student could use some redirection around, gosh, nobody gets it all right all the time. And we only learn when we get it wrong. If we got things right all the time, then learning wouldn't be particularly joyful because we wouldn't be learning anything new. So I really do see the journaling practice and this particular journaling practice as opportunities for all kinds of extensions related to literacy learning beyond that act of writing. Teachers also share that that it's a form of it's a really quick assessment in a whole host of ways because we see students spell the way that they know how to spell it. And we see where they start to get repetitive with their ideas. But most importantly, it reveals the invisible thinking that kids have that they choose to share with us.
And I think it seems like an opportunity for students who may not be comfortable, may not be the most vocal, may never raise their hand in class, to still have an opportunity to have a voice and to be heard in their own way by the teacher. So I'm a big fan of the journaling.
Yeah, me too. It's changed my life, you know, and I started to realize too, gosh, this changed my life so profoundly. It just made me a happier person. It made me assume connection instead of disconnection with other people more often. And so I started to wonder, well, what if teachers also engaged in this practice? What would that mean for their work with students? And what if students were doing this and we didn't wait until adulthood to start to learn some of these life strategies as a natural part of what it means to be a literacy learner? I also really saw this as a call to action around equity. And, you know, Harvard and Stanford and Yale and UPenn, their most popular courses with thousands of students are around these ideas. And I started to wonder and even get a little angry about the idea that you needed to go to one of those institutions in order to learn these things. And that this shouldn't be for the privileged few, that joy is a right for all children. And so the book I really saw as I tried to create a simple framework that would be a guidebook for teachers using any curriculum and in any circumstances to be able to select the things that made the most sense for them in bringing more joy to their students.
Yeah, it seemed to me, Katie, that some of the strategies that you shared, because what I love about the book is you talk about some of these basic tenets, these pillars for starting with joy, but then you provided some invitations or ways to integrate this into what they're already doing. And they're really simple, deceptively simple moves. Things like what you could do to bring more joy to the read aloud. You know, teachers are doing it anyway, but how do you make just a slight shift in how you approach that so that students don't tune out, they tune in?
Yeah. Oh, that's such a beautiful way of saying it, that they not tune out, they tune in. I'm going to have to steal that, Faye. I love that.
You can have it.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to share it widely. Yeah, I think, you know, there's so much beautiful work in this field, too, around the read aloud, you know, to credit the other people who have done wonderful things like Lester Lamanick's approach and Stephen Lane, who has a beautiful Stenhouse book around this very topic of the read aloud. But the read aloud is, to me, a non-negotiable. It's the place where the greatest joy, I think, can happen, because you have this beautiful opportunity for it's the teacher's voice, it is the students' voices and questions that we can't always predict, and the joy of the spontaneity of that. We have the voice of the author, we have the talent and creativity of the illustrator if you're doing a read aloud from a picture book, and all of those things come together in a moment that is authentic to that in real time, that exact moment is not replicable because the students are invited to share their thoughts and their wonderings about these powerful characters and situations that they're in.
And they're doing it as a group.
Yeah.
So it's that sense of community, all accessing that story together in real time.
Yeah.
Right?
And I think some of my emphasis on the read aloud, too, came from when I was doing my doctoral work. My dissertation was about the read aloud. And I worked with teachers in 4 different schools that had very different social locations of the kids, and they all wanted to use read alouds for social justice purposes. And so even when we're tackling things that are discomforting, there's comfort in the read aloud, that there's comfort in coming together. And the read aloud is really the best place I know for starting to engage in some of the discomforting work around social justice and how we can make a better world. So a lot of that work started for me a number of years ago around around the read aloud and realizing that even complicated conversations about hard topics can be joyful experiences in and of themselves.
Do you think that has to do with the fact that you are accessing it as a group, as a part of a community of listeners? Katie, do you think that's part of it, or?
Yeah, I think the big part of it is it invites children's voices to participate if you conduct your read aloud that way. You know, if you see it as really being a student, an experience that's about the students, then you invite their questions and wonderings and ideas, and that we can start to shift the script, so to speak, for read alouds from teacher as one that asks the questions to the students being the ones that ask the questions. And great stories invite great big questions. So yeah, I'm a big believer in the power of the read aloud as a space that is naturally a joyful, celebratory experience every time you come together around a great story. And I also advocate that it's a instructional method we have that the story itself is the reason for coming together. And I sort of jokingly say this sometimes at conferences, but I've never seen a student lean in on the rug because they can't wait to learn a new strategy. I've just never seen it, right? But, and not that strategy work isn't important, because it is. But if we start with the strategy, we've lost some kids because they will tune out. But if we start with the story, or we start with a big question, then kids lean in for that. And so I do spend a lot of time sort of looking what's hidden in plain sight. And I go on what I call joy walks through schools, where I'm looking for the places and the moments where students are naturally smiling and laughing with one another and asking questions. Because to me, that's what joy looks like in school. And a lot of times it's at the read aloud. Yeah.
Well, because there's engagement, right? I mean, I think that's at the heart of it. To your point, they're leaning in because they're really engaged in that story or in what one of their peers is asking. And it seems like that without that engagement, how can they possibly be academically successful, right? Schools are supposed to focus on the academic, but I've heard you say this in some of your talks. You can't discount the body and the mind and everything else around that student. School shouldn't just be about nurturing their minds, right?
Yeah, and teachers have such a huge task ahead of them of you've got 20-something or even 30-something students sitting in front of you, and you have to tend to all of their strengths and all of their challenges, and that, of course, teachers are thinking of the whole child in front of them, and the whole, 30 children in front of them, and it's a huge job. But yeah, I really do believe that school is a place for more than thinking, that it's for acting and feeling, and really all that students want to know is that they're doing a good job, that they're worthy of love and belonging in that classroom. And my oldest son, who I had shared earlier, has had some years where he has struggled with the dynamics of the institution of school. And he has said things certain years like, "Mom, I don't think that my teacher has ever had a student like me before." And then I sometimes ask, tell me more about that. And he'll say, "She just doesn't know me." And sometimes that's like in the spring. And he has said things like that. And so I think our first charge is to get to know our students. It's why the first pillar in the book is connection. Because without that pillar, none of the others matter. And I do see some teachers maybe more easily and naturally connect with their students, and others struggle with that. And that doesn't mean that you're not a great teacher, but it means that there's work to be done to make connection the strongest pillar of your classroom. And so that chapter is really all about helping teachers, one, affirm the things they might already be doing around connection and connecting with students, but also supports teachers that if that's not your strength, then it can be. And here's how you can design for it.
Yeah, there was an example in the Connections chapter that struck me. There was a young boy who was reading a book, and it was clear he was not communicating very well in his journal, but he was enraptured with that book.
Yeah.
And it really took, I think maybe a recommendation from you to the teacher to just read the book he's reading and get to know it on his level. And that really unlocked that connection with that student for that teacher. A simple move. Read the book that he loves so much, and you will learn so much about that child, right?
Yeah, I can picture this second grader in my mind so clearly. I call him Owen in the book, but of course he has a different name. And for a couple years actually in school, he is such a voracious reader, and he was devouring books. And to look at him was to look at somebody who has such a strong identity as a reader. He also read in the corners of his classroom, and he also read during recess. He read on the bench. There were wonderfully, tremendously important things about his reading life, but he also was rather lonely in that reading life. And he took himself out of the classroom conversations in favor of living a life within the pages of books. And that can bring great comfort, and that can be a wonderful life strategy to find yourself in the pages of books. But we also wanted this boy to participate in the life of the classroom and to have a partner. And the books that he was reading, I specifically write that he was reading Redwall, the Redwall series by Brian Jacques, and it's a huge book for a second grader. So none of his peers were going to be reading that. So to have a book partner, have a reading partner, there wasn't always a natural fit for him because he was reading things that the other students weren't reading. And so there was a loneliness there, and we started to identify that. And we didn't just want to stick with the status quo of he's just going to make his way through school for the next couple of years within the pages of books. And we wanted to see, well, what would happen if you, the teacher, became his book partner? And rather than pulling up alongside him and trying to offer him a strategy or asking him comprehension questions to assess what he knew about the book and what he didn't know, that really the way to start with Joy was for the teacher to read the books that he was reading and just to share her own connections to the characters without a question and without an agenda, other than letting him know, I'm reading and loving these books too. And it brought him into the fold, slowly but surely, to step away from the corners of the classroom and to just start to share the amazing experiences he was having with books with others.
So she connected with him by connecting to what he was connecting to.
Yes. Yeah, it was like a whole chain of connection.
It was a chain. But I could imagine that child, if she hadn't intervened in that way, becoming a successful student, but a lonely adult who might be in the library looking up the science of happiness as an adult, right?
Yeah. Well, and we already knew he was a lonely child, that he did not have a lot of connection, was not a strong pillar in his life within school. And that's the case for many children. And sometimes we keep on teaching our lessons and we keep on offering strategies and we help them build their book stacks, but sometimes we have to do more.
So Katie, connection is the first pillar, and like you said, it's really the linchpin for the book and for establishing those relationships. But I am going to say I was extremely intrigued by some of the other pillars. Can you speak specifically to movement?
Yes.
Because I thought that was really interesting, and I could see a whole lot of joy from the little ones coming from that one.
Yeah, and I think we need movement at all ages. That movement is like, joy should be a right and movement should be too. And one of the few times in life where we're really constricted with our movement is when we're in school.
Yes.
And, as adults, we're free to choose, like, I need to get up and stretch. I need to go get a drink of water. I need to go to the bathroom. And we don't always see those same rights given to children or to students in school settings. So there's kind of a story there too as to why I felt like that was such an important pillar for starting with Joy. Really rooted in my own children. Both had experiences in early childhood going to an occupational therapist, an OT, who, gosh, she is just a magic maker. And she was one of the most joyful people that I'd ever met. And the things that she did with my children were so amazing. And I thought, gosh, I don't know anything about this, and I'm a teacher, and that we need to do much more partnership work with OTs and their expertise in childhood movement. But that one way to start with joy is to get children and students really up and moving, out of their seats, moving around the classroom. Really, to give credit, Catherine Hernandez has a beautiful book, Activate, where she suggests an alternative to the turn and talk is walk and talk.
Oh, I love that.
Isn't it? It's like such a simple, brilliant move. It requires, though, huge trust in your students to say, gosh, instead of turning and talking today, because we've gotten so good at that, you're ready now to walk and talk around the classroom with your partner. And we're just going to do it for 30 seconds, and then you're going to come on back, when you hear my voice or when you feel like you're ready. What an invitation for students to get up and move their bodies. And we think of our brains and our bodies as separate, and they're not. And so when we feel constricted or boxed in our bodies, it limits the ways in which we can think, especially as literacy learners. So so that chapter is really rooted in the learning that I had done thanks to this magic maker of an OT in my own children's life, and realizing, whoa, we can make very simple, subtle shifts to introduce movement into the learning process. And it's happening really widely in schools, but actually maybe it's happening in pockets in schools. And even anecdotally, I was doing work with a team of 6th grade teachers this past week, who I'm so fortunate to partner with them on designing Capstone inquiry-based units for 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, where students are choosing their topics, they're choosing the format of how they're going to share what they found, and in some cases, there also has an action component to it. But the teachers, one of the components of this unit is that they're going on a field trip to a museum. And the teachers had thought, let's launch that work by having the students view the museum website and jot down what they notice and wonder. And I had suggested, well, what if, because I think that starting with joy is also asking big what if questions that maybe other people haven't asked yet. And I said, well, what if, instead of just clicking around on the website, which is kind of a static and lonely process, right? I've got me and a screen, and I'm clicking around. I didn't feel like there was a lot to wonder looking at the website, because the museum did a really great job of telling you what you're going to see. There wasn't a lot to wonder there. I said, well, what if we introduced movement into the process? What if we introduced peer interaction into the process? And what if we just went low tech with this instead of high tech? And so I'd suggested that they print out images from the website, put them on big pieces of chart paper, and have students move around the room in small groups, jotting down what they see and what they wonder about the image. And it introduced a whole new element to it, where the planning that they'd done around viewing the museum website was a perfectly fine plan. It was perfectly purposeful. It just wasn't particularly memorable or joyful. But I think that the students are going to remember having what I call their heads in a huddle around the images. And when they get back from the museum, they can also revisit those initial noticings and wonderings that they'd done collaboratively and say, gosh, what I thought was right, or what I thought was so different from what we experienced. And you can save those as classroom artifacts. But the big piece of it is that it invited students to move around the room from image to image, and to trust students to take that opportunity seriously. And you can smile and be serious at the same time.
Yeah, and there is science behind this, right? I mean, that even the act of stretching, or endorphins, just being able to move around and look at things from a different perspective automatically just helps engage your mind a little bit.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, it's even been said that sitting is the new smoking.
I've heard that.
And this is sort of becoming a bit of a catchphrase now. But wow, who are the people that we ask to sit the most? It tends to be students that are school-aged.
Well, I'll tell you, last week I was getting teased by some of my colleagues because I volunteered to clean out one of the offices at our office. And they said, "You are avoiding a project right now." And I said, "No, I'm not." And I was finishing the project, and I went back to my desk, and I finished my writing project. And again, they said, "Yeah, we know you were procrastinating." And I said, "No, I needed to do something else with my hands while I was thinking." Because that's the way I'm programmed. I needed to be moving.
Yeah.
And when I got back to my desk, I finished my writing piece because I needed that kind of physical movement to get my brain going.
Yeah.
Is that funny?
You know, and my youngest son is built to move, and I say that movement is his strength. Mm-hmm. He has such strength in movement. And again, we've been so fortunate that his teachers have also seen it that way. So, you know, I'm a fidgeter by nature. I will play with a paper clip or something. And a lot of young people are sensory craving in different ways. And if we don't honor those needs, they're going to come out one way or another. Mm-hmm. And they're going to come out in disruption or sort of what we might see as negative behaviors, when really they might just be cries for the need for movement that we haven't recognized because we didn't design for it. Right. And so if we know that there's a human need to move, and that school is a time in our life where we don't move an awful lot necessarily, we can look at our lesson plans and say, okay, where can I build in movement? Where can I build in more connection? Where can I build in more play in ways that are simple and small but have huge impact on the joy factor for kids? So yeah, that website and shifting it to Heads in a Huddle and moving around the classroom, it took the same amount of time. It took nearly the same amount of planning, but the end result was a much more memorable and joyful experience for the students.
Well, again, another example of not disrupting the curriculum.
Right.
Still teaching and working with the curriculum that teacher was supposed to work on,
Yeah.
but just taking a different tack, right?
Yep.
And building joy into it.
Yeah. Yeah, the teaching points even don't have to change, right? The units that exist within your school, they don't have to change, but the ways in which we enact those can have really simple, subtle shifts, especially if you are recognizing that your students are stressed or tired or bored, and probably a good number of them are one of those things that we can ask ourselves, what if we make little changes and adapt curriculum sometimes rather than fully adopt it? And what are the ways in which those adaptations that we make empower teachers to be designers once again and bring more joy to students? Why would we not do that? So that's sort of the hope that I have for this book, is that it encourages, maybe affirms for teachers the wonderful things that they're already doing to bring joy to students' lives. But that if you're recognizing that you want your classroom to be a more joyful place, that it gives you the blueprint for how to do that in really simple and manageable ways.
Joyful students become joyful adults.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Well, thank you so much,
Thank
Katie.
you, Faye.
Thanks
This was
for
great
taking
fun.
the time.
Yeah, I loved it. Thanks so much.
Start with Joy, Designing Literacy Learning for Student Happiness is available at stenhouse.com. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Teacher's Corner, and we'd love to hear from you. Please send your questions and comments to us at marketing@stenhouse.com. Thanks for listening.